Thanks very much for having us. I'm just going to share my screen and Ken will get us started off.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much for inviting us to this wonderful conference. So, my name is Ken Zolitar, and I'm our Manager of Stakeholder Relations at ParticipACTION. And I do a lot of work with engaging stakeholders such as yourselves and getting communities across Canada active. And Lee, who will be doing most of the sharing of our findings today, on our participation report card. I'll let Lee introduce herself as now that the screen is all set up, and then I'll be back and I'll be able to answer questions throughout the presentation. So if you do have any questions, you can throw them into the chat, and I will answer them as Lee is presenting, as well as at the end for any questions related to the ParticipACTION app, the Community Better Challenge, and the report card. So with that, Lee, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ken. And thank you to everyone for having us here today. So the majority of the presentation today, we're going to spend looking at the recent findings from our 2020 Children and Youth Report Card. So essentially, for those of you that may be less familiar with our report card, the main goal of this is really to serve as an in-depth and detailed summary or synthesis of all the best available evidence with regards to children's physical activity and sedentary behaviors for that particular year. So we're currently working on our next report card for 2022, and it'll be released this fall. And so essentially what we do is throughout the report card, we'll have a number of different guidelines, as well as indicators and recommendations in terms of based on the evidence, where are Canadian children and youth ranking, and where are some potential areas for improvement. So we will spend a little bit of time walking through some of the actual methodology, as well as going over the main findings. But just to start off, the main focus of our 2020 report card was really on this idea of the family influence. So our main kind of takeaway statement was that families play a crucial role in shaping and influencing all areas of kids' lives, including their physical activity, sedentary behaviors, as well as sleep. So as I mentioned, this really does represent the largest synthesis available with regards to children's physical activity levels. And we don't just look at their individual behaviors, but looking at various sources of influence. So whether it's the physical environment, the social environment, where they're getting active, so at home, in the community, at school, as well as looking even more broadly at what type of infrastructure is available, programming, as well as investments from various levels of the government. We recently extended into the adults. We've released 2 report cards focusing on the activity levels of adults and older adults. And our children and youth report card has actually been replicated in about close to now 60 countries across the globe. And so we're really happy from even a national pride perspective in that researchers and practitioners in Canada are really leading the way when it comes to areas such as physical literacy and physical activity research, knowing that there's other countries across the globe that have adopted our approach. So in the 2020 report card, we've released an embedded knowledge product, otherwise known as our consensus statement on the role of family in children's and youth's movement behaviors, so physical activity, sleep, as well as sedentary behaviors. And what we really found is that, based on all the research that we looked at to look at what degree is that, families really do play an important role on children and youth in achieving, healthy levels of physical activity, sedentary behaviors, as well as sleep. And not just from an encouragement perspective, but also from a co-participation, a facilitation, a modeling perspective, as well as setting expectations with regards to these behaviors. Obviously it goes without saying there's other really important sources of influence, such as, the healthcare setting, childcare, early learning environments, the community. And we also purposely left our definition of family very broad. So we weren't necessarily just looking at, the typical, 2-parent household, but really understanding that family can differ very differently from family to family and what that means. Sometimes there's a huge role of grandparents or elders, aunts and uncles, older siblings. And so we purposely left our definition of family quite broad for that exact purpose. The overall recommendations that we found from a family perspective is that parents can be an active role model in their kids' lives. So some of the newest research showed that for every additional 20 minutes that parents engage in physical activity, this resulted in at least an extra 5 minutes in their children's physical activity levels. So that's a pretty concrete kind of conversion in terms of what we know is that when parents are active, their kids are also going to be clocking more minutes of physical activity. They can play a really important role in supporting their kids' activity levels, not just by co-participating with them, but also by facilitating, encouraging, watching their kids get active or engage in, outdoor active play or even sports. And that, to be active as a family should be viewed as a priority. So how do we make family time active time? With regards to screen time, one of the top recommendations was to find a way as a family unit to reduce screen times, to designate screen-free zones within the house, primarily during mealtime, as well as keeping screens out of the bedroom, and to find ways to creatively replace those otherwise sedentary opportunities with more active ones. Recent data does suggest that about 52% of parents said that they spend too much time on their phones, and that this is an increase from 2016, where they reported about 29% agreed with that statement. By age 11, we know that over half of children have their own smartphone, and that this increases to 69% just a year later by the age of 12. There's also research to support that in North America, about 1/3 of youth keep their phones in bed with them. And we know that this not only results in increased screen viewing, but it also results in a decrease or delayed onset for sleep. So some final recommendations would be regards to, reclaim family time as active time, use active transportation or even mixed modes of transportation to get to destinations as a family. So beyond the commute to school and to work, for example, which are great, opportunities to sneak in a little bit more movement. Also look for other ways, whether it's getting to a friend's house, dropping off at a play date, going to the store, or even just other opportunities, maybe going to, a park in the nearby vicinity or community center. We would also encourage more outdoor time. So we know that individuals are more active and less sedentary outdoors, and you're also going to get exposure to natural sunlight, which is going to help also with balancing out your circadian rhythms or your sleep-wake cycles. So we'll now spend the next couple of minutes taking a little bit of a closer look at the indicators and the grades that were assigned within the actual report card. So as a reminder, the grades are determined by the best available data, research, and key issues from the past year, or in this particular case, the past 2 years. As I mentioned, we grouped our indicators into various categories, whether it be daily behaviors, individual characteristics such as physical literacy and physical fitness, spaces and places, so where children and youth might be getting active, and then lastly, looking at strategies and investments. Just like a report card in terms of methodology, each of the indicators had an assigned benchmark. And so we assigned a letter grade from A to F, depending on which proportion of children and youth were either meeting or falling short of meeting those respective guidelines. We then provided specific either gaps or recommendations from a research, practice, and policy perspective moving forward. So to kind of serve as an informal kind of research or policy agenda. So moving to the first category, which was daily behaviors. So for overall physical activity, children and youth received a grade of D+, and this is because 39% of 5 to 17-year-olds were currently meeting the physical activity guidelines within the 24-hour movement guidelines, which is currently 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. In terms of active play, so looking at more of that unstructured child-led play, this could be, energetic play among young children, or some of those unstructured, say, pickup games of sports. There is a grade of F, so only about 21% of children 5 to 11-year-old in Canada are spending at least more than 1.5 hours in organized physical activity, according to their parents. With regards to active transportation, a grade of D- was assigned. This was based on both parent and self-report data among individuals 5 to 19-year-olds. Only about 21% were using active modes of transportation, 63% used inactive modes, and about 16 used a combination of active and inactive modes of transportation. So an example of that would be, say, using public transit to get to a certain part of your trip, and then walking or wheeling to or from the transit stops, for example. With regards to organized sports, children in Canada are faring quite well. So about 77% of individuals between the ages of 5 and 19 are participating in some form of organized sports or activity. So it could also be organized programming. With regards to physical education, so the amount of physical education classes in during school hours, it was a grade of D+. So about 37% of 5 to 11-year-olds and only 36% of 12 to 17-year-olds report participating in at least 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity during class time each week. Now kind of looking at the other end, we're getting into sedentary behaviors. And so probably not surprisingly, a grade of D+ was assigned. And so 76% of 5 to 11-year-olds and only 28% of 12 to 17-year-olds were meeting national sedentary behavior recommendations, which include participating in less than or no more than 2 hours of recreational screen use per day. So if you think about your own kids or the kids that might be within your current areas of practice, it's probably not surprising that we are seeing these numbers. An important point or an important area to point out is that almost consistently for both sedentary behaviors and physical activity, we had girls either clocking less minutes of physical activity or more sedentary time in comparison to boys. Sleep is another area where children in Canada are doing quite well. So about 70% of school-age children are meeting the current sleep recommendations, which depending on their age, usually ranges from about 8 to 10 hours of good quality sleep every night. So again, this is an area where we are doing quite well. If we look at the 24-hour movement behaviors together, so engaging in the right amount of sleep, physical activity, and sedentary behaviors over a 24-hour period, we're seeing that Canadian children and youth are only getting a grade of F. And so only about 15% of kids between the ages of 5 and 17 are actually engaging in adequate amounts of all three behaviors every single day on average. So some recommendations, and this was by far the largest kind of group of indicators that we looked at, is that, one, we're looking at these grades, is that it's important to involve family members in the creation of a family media plan, nurture frequent active play opportunities, so really harboring those opportunities or fostering those opportunities for unstructured child-led play. Sleep literacy or sleep hygiene should be something that we talk about not only as a family, but within the school system. And then also ensuring that this is something that is promoted not only and discussed not only in the family households, but at school as well, with regards to why it's important for us to be active. Moving on to the second category, there were two indicators that we looked at under individual characteristics. And the first one was physical literacy. And so children here received a grade of D+, with only about 36% of 8 to 12-year-olds in Canada assessed by the CAPEWOL tool. So this is the Canadian assessment of physical literacy. Were found to either meet or exceed the minimum level of recommended for physical literacy. So again, definitely some areas for improvement with regards to looking at developing those fundamental movement skills, as well as that confidence and self-efficacy in carrying out particular activities. When we look more specifically at physical fitness, most of the data we found were for slightly older school-aged kids. And we found that about among 9 to 12-year-olds, The majority were in the 29th percentile for cardiorespiratory fitness based on their age and sex in comparison to international normative data. So again, we are seeing a decrease in terms of how much aerobic fitness these kids are engaging in, but more specifically in terms of what quality we are seeing a decrease in. So what are some overall recommendations from policy and practice perspective? Is to use a combination of physical literacy assessment tools to provide a more holistic and accurate representation of physical literacy. So we want to look at some of those quantitative skills with regards to some of those core physical fitness competencies, sorry. But we also want to get at some of those qualitative things. So in terms of how they're feeling, how they're experiencing that, how might they assess some of more of those qualitative or a little bit more nebulous items, such as their overall feeling of confidence with regards to those particular areas. Parents and educators, as well as various healthcare practitioners, should encourage children and youth to participate in a large range of activities that support the development of cardiorespiratory and musculoskeletal fitness. And to also find a way that as we continue to develop or attain more data, to find a way to ensure that we're sharing this among the sector so we can help develop better standards of practice for this particular area of focus. Moving on to the third area, we're looking at spaces and places, so where children and youth are getting active. So the first is household. So about 16% of 18 to 39-year-olds and 17% of 40 to 59-year-olds are meeting the National Physical Activity Guidelines. And so if we're looking at household, we're seeing that even less percent of adults, so even smaller proportions of adults and older adults are meeting the recommended physical activity guidelines for this particular group, which is 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So if we think back to some of the information that we had from the consensus statement in terms of the importance of, more active parents leads to more active children, we can kind of see where some of those, where we can kind of extrapolate, and knowing that such a small percentage are actually meeting these guidelines among adults, what types of consequences or impact that might have on their children. When we're looking at specific provinces, so sometimes we did have provincial data, about 92% of students in grades 9 to 12 in British Columbia, Alberta, Nunavut, Ontario, and Quebec reporting having parents, step-parents, or guardians who support them in being physically active. For school, not too bad, a B-. So about 48% of school administrators in Canada report having a fully implemented policy to provide daily physical activity education or mandated physical activity to all students. So in some provinces, it's referred to as DPA. And then for community environment, so again, B+. So kind of some of the trends we're seeing is that from a settings and places perspective, we're actually not doing too bad. We seem to have those venues available. So from a B+, so among municipalities in Canada with at least 1,000 residents, as many as 1/3 have policies that relate to physical activity. So whether it be they have formal strategies with regards to physical activity or plans regarding active transportation, they might have some sort of designated policy regarding safe pedestrian and bicycle routes across the country, or again, have some sort of master formal or some sort of formal transportation master plan that includes how to safely engage in active transportation, whether it be walking, wheeling, cycling. From a summary perspective, it is recommended that programs encourage families to be active together, and that this exact idea should be supported from a policy perspective. Indoor recesses caused by inclement weather should not be spent on screen. So in instances where not only we have inclement weather, we should ensure that still opportunities to be active or to move around are provided, even if it means we can't go outdoors, and to also reconsider how we use removal of recess time as punishment for misbehavior. Oftentimes those children are the ones that require so it's not about taking away things are taking away or avoiding discipline. It's considering other ways that we can regard behavioral issues without removing recess. Communities should dedicate part of their capital plan to recreational facility revitalization to ensure equitable access. And to ensure that parents and their children have access to inclusive out of school time physical activity programs. So beyond ones that are just offered by the school system. And then lastly, moving into strategy and investment. And so the only indicator under this particular group was government, and we received a grade of B minus. And so looking at, there was in the last 2 years, various levels of investment. So whether it was specifically targeting women and girls participation in sport, additional funds were also provided to help support other minority or equity seeking groups, such as various Indigenous communities across the country. About 70% of federal, provincial, and territorial governments report that funds invested in physical activity has remained the same over the past fiscal years. So from about 2019 to about 2021. And that about 90% of federal, provincial, and territorial governments reported modifying or adapting their physical activities and programs to better align with the common vision, Let's Get Active, that was introduced in 2019. Where we are in terms of recommendations, well, we certainly want to drive home the idea of enhancing collaboration and alignment across the federal, provincial, territorial, and local governments. Give voice to children and youth by engaging them directly in efforts to conceive, design, develop, implement, as well as evaluate any policies, programs, or services with regards to activities or specific domains that might directly or indirectly impact their movement behaviors. Look at providing leadership development training and community capacity building for those living in rural and remote locations, and that governments at all levels should intentionally address people who are at the greatest risk for physical inactivity by supporting policies that eliminate disparities that impact not just physical activity levels, but I would argue sedentary behaviors as well. So we really want to look at ways that we can build more equitable, diverse, and accessible spaces in which people can get active and stay active. So I will stop things there, and I'll pass it back to Ken to kind of wrap us up and to provide you with a little bit more insight on what resources we have available.
There we go. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lee, for sharing all of that information. And just for the group, I did put into the chat just a website it takes you to the ParticipACTION report card web page that lists all of the resources and the full report. And so as sector leaders, Lee covered through a lot of the different indicators and all of the different grades, some of which may or may not pertain to your particular area. So I think one of the key things to look at when going through the report card is kind of keying in on what's your area. So within each of those grades and indicators, there is there's some recommendations for practice. So if you are a practitioner, a recreation programmer, a coach, an educator, there's a section dedicated to policy. So if you may be working with a municipality or with the government and you're developing some strategies, there are some policy recommendations, as well as some research recommendations identifying those gaps. So the report card can very much be read in a choose your own adventure sort of way. You can find the grades and indicators that are most relevant to you. In this group, it may be those kind of individual behaviors that may make the most sense, and then keying in on those recommendations that again might make the most sense. In this case, it may very well be those practice recommendations. And I think the big takeaway is on that broader consensus statement. The full theme of that report card is asking that question of how can we get the whole family active? What can we do to not just engage the children and youth potentially in the activity, but also do that educational piece, do that engagement piece for the adults. And so going to the resources, there are a few things that we have available that are free to download from that link I provided in the chat. One is a highlight report of the report card. So that is a summary version, which is probably the most useful thing for practitioners to go through and read. The second is a full report. So that has all of the background data, all of the stats and studies. That's probably more geared towards the researchers and the policymakers. The expert statement, which talks more about that family influence that Lee mentioned at the beginning. And it's also worth noting that this is not the first report card that has been produced by ParticipACTION or by the Healthy Kids Alliance, which predated ParticipACTION's participation in the report card. I think this was Leah's going to give me a number with her fingers. It's the 15th or 16th version. Okay. So for the past 2 decades or so, there's been a report card every year or two that goes through those indicators and goes through those grades. And there will be future report cards. So every 2 years, we're going to have a new children and youth report card, and that will offset with the adult report card. And so you can look back to those report cards. Each of those has a different theme. Some focused on screen time, some focused on outdoor play. As you go further back in time, the grades may differ, but I think a lot of those policy recommendations are certainly still valid. And so I think, so that's kind of the covering of those resources. And I know also that a lot of those materials that, or a lot of the things that Lee mentioned may be more pertinent or may have some of the things that's talking about developing a physical activity strategy or an active transportation strategy may seem more relevant to those larger population centers. But certainly it's something where it doesn't need, some of the policies that also may be more applicable for southern communities. I think there certainly can be adaptations to be held up within the northern communities. And this is where I think having this group together and sharing potentially some of those best case practices is very, very wise. And I'm sure through the conference and through the connections, a lot of those recommendations are already being put in place by certain people in certain groups. And so to say, yes, this is a recommendation, and yes, we're doing it, is a great thing to share with others. And so we do this with every report card. Anytime, talking about that knowledge translation piece, talking about, in this case, the key audience was the family, or talking to the parents about their physical activity for children and youth. And so we do create different communication resources that can be used and shared, posters for recreation facilities, social media posts, sorts of things. We'll be doing the same thing for our upcoming report card. And so for any information around that, we encourage you to follow ParticipACTION. We do have a newsletter that you can sign up for. And we've tried to make those resources, as it says in that little white box there, kind of plug and play as ready to go, copy and paste to make your lives easy. So you're not spending so much time creating the comments and hashtags and everything else. So really you can focus more on your role, which is engaging the public and getting the community active. So that is it from us. I think we are spot on time. If you do have any questions, feel free to contact us. Our information is there. So my name is Ken Zolitar. I'm the Manager of Stakeholder Relations and Public Affairs. My email is kzolitar@participaction.com. So feel free to ask me any questions about kind of those practitioner steps. What can we do to get the community active? Dr. Lee Vanderloo is our Knowledge Translation Manager. She can be reached at lvanderloo@participaction.com. So if you have any questions more focused on the actual research and the actual data, she is far better equipped to answer those. So please send emails her way. I think that is it from us. We can certainly, I'll go back to our conference leaders and chair people to see if we have time for questions or comments. But thank you again for your time and attention today.